This conference will now be recorded.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to this special edition of the Brother Marinus, Cause of Brother Marinus event. And we are so fortunate today on December 22nd, 2020, to observe the 70th anniversary of the great event in which 14,000 refugees began to be loaded on the Meredith Victory in Hungnam Harbor in Korea. And today is with us is Phil Lacovara. Phil has written what could be called the definitive biography of Brother Marinus. Now, it's also true that it's the only biography that's been done of Brother Marinus, but that's okay because I understand that concept. When you're the only one, you are the biggest and the most internationally acclaimed one along the way. So, Phil, thanks so much for being with us, and I'd really like you to tell us a little bit about yourself to begin with. Who are you? Where are you from? And also, how did you get involved with this whole Brother Marinus thing?
Well, thank you, Father Oubre. You're reminding me of an expression that my grandfather used to use, which is being a big fish in a small pond. Right now, I'm a big fish in the Brother Marinus pond. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., born and raised there. Went off to school in the Midwest, got married, went to work in various laboratories. I'm a physicist by training, and ended up in Tucson about 30 years ago, and worked out here, then started some businesses. And then a couple of years ago, I was able to sell the businesses so that I had a little bit more flexibility in my life. And I decided I wanted to write. So a couple of years ago, 2018, I started working on a novel, which I was able to finish by the end of the year. And then in the beginning of 2019, I was reading Naval Institute proceedings. I'm a life member of the Naval Institute. Most of my work over the years was with the Navy, one way or the other. And there was an article in there by a man who is well known to the Brother Marinus community, Bob Lunny. And Bob was responding to an article that had been published in the December issue about an event in Korea during December 1950. And this was in February. Bob was commenting about something even more remarkable that happened in Korea in December 1950. And it was the story of the rescue of 14,000 Korean civilians by the Meredith Victory, and the fact that the captain later became a Benedictine monk, and that there was now a cause for his sainthood thanks to the Apostleship of the CUSA. And so through the magic of the internet, I Googled Bob Lunny, found him amazingly through a website in, I think it was Hungary, where he must have corresponded with someone, but it had his email address there. I emailed him and he responded very quickly, and we started an email conversation. And over the course of 2019, I did kind of online research, correspondence with Bob Lunny. And then in September, I went to New York to interview Bob and spent a lovely afternoon with Bob and his charming wife, Joan, and was able to get a little bit better perspective for the story of Brother Marinus. And I decided that I was going to make a book out of this. As you can imagine, when you look at the story and you look at what's been written, the idea of doing a biography of someone who didn't have he didn't have children, he didn't have a wife, he didn't have a girlfriend that we know of, he didn't have a body of letters like someone like John Adams, where historians love it because they kept a stack of letters between him and his wife over the decades. There's nothing like that for Brother Marinus. So what I realized is that the story of Brother Marinus is as much a story of the times where he lived, the ships he sailed, the battles he survived. And so I went in December of 2019 to the East Coast for about a month. And remember, this is going from Tucson in December to Maryland and New York and Philadelphia in December is a commitment. So I hope you realize that. But I had just a wonderful time visiting the places where young Leonard La Rue had been, going to the National Archives, spending a week there, investigating both naval records and U.S. Marine Corps records, and then also Maritime Commission records, and was able to build basically, I collected 5,000 pages of documents over the couple of weeks that I spent on the East Coast. And then I had the pleasure of going down to Miami to interview Burley Smith, and who was another of the surviving officers of the Meredith Victory. And Burley and I spent a couple of hours together. And so in 2020, I started writing and finished it in late summer of this year. Kicked it around with the Naval Institute as a publisher, and Naval Institute had it for a while, and then as I was pinging them to try and understand how long their review process was going to take, they informed me that their whole publication cycle is about 14 months. And since I had made a personal commitment to get this thing done this year, the 70th anniversary, as much out of respect for Bob and Merle Smith and Burley Smith as for any other reason, I decided to publish it using my own imprint, which is something called Catalina Press. So that's where we are.
So just as a technical side, how does one go and do their own imprint? And I know you've go ahead and mention about the book already being available on Kindle, and how are you going to actually get the printed versions going?
Well, we have a wonderful technology nowadays called publish on demand, and what it is the Amazon has its own version of this. I'm actually using a company called Ingram, which started out as the largest distributor of books in the United States. They started a number of years ago a print on demand service, and what that means is that when an order comes in, whether it's from Amazon or directly through Ingram or from one of their client bookstores, they literally print the book, including the covers, and it's done using a very sophisticated inkjet technology. So the nice thing about that is, unlike the old days, when if you published a book, or God forbid if you used what they call vanity presses, where you published a book that nobody else really wanted, but you wanted to publish, you'd end up with stacks of cardboard boxes full of this book in your garage as you tried to get rid of it. Well, now you don't have to hold an inventory. It literally, it's an electronic process from clicking the button at Amazon to the message going to Ingram fulfilling the order. So
it's such a great advancement in the process.
And it's almost as seamless as the Kindle process, which is solely electronic. As far as the paperback and hardcover versions, they are both in Ingram's internal review to generate proofs. So I expect within a day or two they'll be complete. They'll be available, and they're pretty good about transmitting that information to Amazon. It'll show up within a day.
Well, that's great, and be sure to fire us a note down so that we can push that. Doreen's got about 2,000 people on your constant contact list, and let people know about that to be able to get copies at that point. And I know the work that you're doing is going to be so important for the Historical Commission for the cause of Brother Marinus, because just as you said, Dorothy Day had 20,000 pages that she wrote, which is great because you'll certainly get an idea of Dorothy Day. It's terrible because you've got to transcribe all that stuff and you have to write them, and then all that has to be theologically reviewed. We're going to have a very short theological review on this in this case. But can you tell us something about the early life of Brother Marinus? Because we know the story, or we can go to Manhattan's story on the Ship of Miracles and get the story. But there's a whole nother story of this young boy in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Nautical School, but also PQ-13.
Well, as you say, he grew up in Philadelphia. We have very little information. Basically, the only information I could find that pointed at all to his childhood before the Pennsylvania Nautical School was census data. Now, that's how I could tell where he lived, where. The Nautical School, of course, gave him a great foundation, and in the book there's from his yearbook, known as The Helm, in 1934. There's some nice vignettes about the cruises that he went on. That was one of the core pieces of his education at the nautical school aboard the ship USS Annapolis, was that twice a year the cadets would take a cruise, the Caribbean, up the northeastern coast of the United States, over to Europe. And so we don't have any correspondence from that, but we do have a picture of what it was like for him during that period. During his in his graduation year in 1934, there's a really very charming passage that describes him, as all the graduates have a photograph, a picture of them, as well as a description written by the editors of the yearbook about Leonard La Rue, young Leonard La Rue. And it's very cute because, among other things, it teases him for being seasick all the time.
I'm in solidarity with that.
And also teases him for his singing, which, as you may know if you talk to any of the folks at St. Paul's Abbey, he apparently was famous or infamous for belting it out when it was time to sing. And according to Father Joel, the former abbot, he could never understand anyone who wouldn't sing with gusto, particularly in some ecclesiastical setting. But I'm sure he would sing popular tunes too at some point. But it's very cute how those pieces of his personality are it's one of the few places we see them exposed early on. So you mentioned PQ-13. Most of us are familiar with the infamous PQ-17, which was the convoy a few months later to Murmansk, where almost three-quarters of the ships were sunk, the merchantmen. 13 was no cakewalk either. Starting when he boarded the Mormacmar in Boston, where it was being loaded, there was tension between the crew and the officers, and it's never entirely clear what the origin of that was. But early in the voyage, well, first of all, before they even left Boston, the local naval authorities had to be brought on board to get the crew under control. So the ship sets sail. It works its way up the coast as part of a convoy on its way to Halifax. And before it even gets to Halifax, the captain is replaced. So again, it's unclear from the records exactly what happened, but the captain was replaced. So the ship set sail from Halifax across the Atlantic, and midway across, it ran into as the commentator, who is the commanding officer of the Naval Armed Guard, says, a typical North Atlantic gale. And among the cargo that the Mormacmar was carrying to Murmansk was 500 barrels of white phosphorus. Now, as you know, white phosphorus is an incendiary. And during the course of the gale, the barrels actually broke loose. Some of the barrels broke loose and caught on fire. So we have this image of this ship in a North Atlantic gale, the crew and the members of the armed guard struggling to resecure this cargo, trying to avoid being swept overboard, trying to avoid hypothermia, all the risks that these mariners had, eventually getting under control and making their way first to Lake Ewe in Scotland, and then up to Valdfjordur, I can never pronounce it, a large fjord near Reykjavik, where the convoys would reform before they made their way to Murmansk. So the trouble with the crew wasn't over at that point. There was again a revolt or a near mutiny by members of the crew who refused to turn to resecure the cargo, that some of which had come loose during the voyage, and they presented a protest, which was their right under their contract, to the captain, who was obligated to present that protest to the consul general in Reykjavik. He did so. The consul general agreed with the captain that the protest was groundless. The captain returned to the ship, presented that information, and the crew refused to work. So the Coast Guard came on board. A Coast Guard officer came aboard with a half dozen or dozen armed Marines and instructed the crew to get to work. Crew still refused, and a couple of the malcontents were taken off the ship. And to make a long story short, 3 of them were actually held in the brig in Reykjavik till much later. They did not continue on to Murmansk, so they were probably happy about that. The ship eventually sailed with 3 Icelandic sailors, taking the place of 3 crewmen who remained in Reykjavik, and they made their way across the Norwegian Sea to Murmansk, and then came under fire from a combination of Luftwaffe aircraft and Kriegsmarine destroyers. I don't recall if they were actually also targeted on that leg by submarines, but of course everything was there. And that was the challenge, as you recall, of that route, was that since the Nazis controlled the North, they controlled all of Norway, including the North Cape, the convoys would be under attack from 3 dimensions: under the water, on the surface, and from the air. So it was dicey. Mormac-Mar with La Rue aboard made it to Murmansk. They enjoyed the incredible lack of amenities in Murmansk for the remainder of their time, which was a couple of months, and then they made their way back. Again, came under attack several times. A couple of ships were sunk, including a British cruiser. Mm-hmm. But he made it back to New York safe and sound.
I find it very interesting in the reading that I've done on PQ-13. The Mormac-Mar is like listed as in the convoy, but everything sort of surrounds, I think, the Edinburgh and some of the other ships that are part of the convoy.
Right.
The reference that was there, and the Mormac-Mar showed up at Murmansk on this day, and sort of what happens at the beginning, everything seems to focus on the destroyer, naval side, and some of the ships that were lost, and it seemed almost that the Mormac-Mar just sort of was off on the edge and nobody was paying attention to her very much, but she did come under attack.
Oh, several times. They were as you read it, I don't want to use the term miraculous too freely, but it is, as you'll see it in the book. As I read the armed guard reports, the Naval Armed Guard reports, there were a number of times when a few hundred yards would have made all the difference. La Rue would have been in the water with his shipmates, because ships all around them were being attacked and some of them were sunk. So it was, whether it was Providence or not, he didn't have any less of a time of it than any other ship that was there. They all were under attack, and it was just the misfortune of the Raceland and ships like that to actually connect with the torpedo or with the bomb. But even when they were in Murmansk, they were under attack, I forget, 40 or 50 times during the month or month and a half they were in Murmansk. It was not ever an easy trip for any of the people who were, any of the men who were on those ships making that route.
And then the QP-11, which they returned back on, if I remember correctly, was no cakewalk, and that's when the Edinburgh was lost. The
right.
British.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. The Brits had a cruiser, I think the Trinidad, damaged in PQ-13, and then the Edinburgh was lost at the end of QP-11 and beginning of QP-11. And interestingly, the Edinburgh, unbeknownst to the Germans, the Edinburgh was actually carrying gold. Mm-hmm. That the Russians were sending back to England in partial payment for the supplies they were receiving. And so the Edinburgh was not a ship the Brits wanted to lose, but they didn't have any choice. It was lost. and it wasn't actually salvaged. The gold wasn't salvaged until I think in the 1980s.
If I remember correctly, was it that or Edinburgh or the Trinidad actually got hit by its own torpedo?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, right. Fired the
That,
torpedo, German Kriegs naval vessel, and it malfunctioned and came around and whacked them.
that was bad luck.
That's the ultimate.
Very bad day.
Yeah, that
So-
was that I think was Trinidad.
Oh, that was the Trinidad. Okay.
I think you can look at it.
so-
Yeah.
I know Captain La Rue continued to sail throughout the Second World War, but I don't really know much about what was he doing during that time. Did he get caught up in Anzio, or did he run into the Mediterranean, or what?
Well, the next couple trips he took, the next trip he took was the Mormackmar, and he actually went around the world on Mormackmar. It took him almost a year, and that was an interesting trip because they went across the Atlantic, around the skirted the coast, the Atlantic coast of Africa, stopped in Cape Town, and then they worked their way up the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. Now remember, the reason for supplies going to Murmansk was to supply the Soviet Union, and another of the routes to the Soviet Union was through the Persian Gulf, the rail over or road or rail over Iran, and so it's interesting. As difficult as Murmansk was to get to, at least you had supplies delivered close to the front. When they went into the Persian Gulf, they had a long way to go, and it was a very long and thin supply line. So Mormackmar got to the Gulf, and it was the classic hurry up and wait. They swung at anchor. They had to swing at anchor when they first got there. Then they went up to Shatt al Arab and unloaded some of their cargo. Then they came back down and sat at anchor. They endured a dust storm that was so bad they had to blow their foghorn all night. They eventually offloaded all of their cargo and went on to Calcutta, where again they had to deal with the crowds in Calcutta as well as Japanese air raids. So La Rue and the Mormackmar were in Calcutta for the first of the Japanese air raids against the city, to the point where they had trouble getting stevedores or the tug captains to work at night. So they offloaded, or they loaded their cargo in Calcutta, cargo of jute and tea, and worked their way down the Pacific to Australia, New Zealand, Australia. I don't remember anyway. It was Australia, and while they were in Australia, on their way to Australia, they hit a bad storm, and Mormackmar started to lose its rudder. The ship had actually had damage in the late 30s, which had apparently been repaired, but in the course of this storm, the rudder came loose in its mountings, and the hull cracked to the point where the aft peak tank started to leak. So they got into harbor. They had to put the ship in dry dock. In order to put the ship in dry dock, they had to offload part of the cargo to make the ship light enough to float into the dry dock. After the ship was repaired, before they get all the cargo loaded, the cargo caught on fire in the warehouse next to the dock. So there was certainly no lack of excitement, whether it was U-boats or Japanese aircraft or burning cargo. Captain La Rue, at that point, third mate La Rue, certainly had some excitement as he made his way around the world.
Yeah, one of the things that seems to be very interesting as we delved more and more about Captain La Rue's life is how many times the Hungnam rescue situation could have not happened. Last time we were together with on Maritime TV back in September, we talked about the Incheon landing and how the Meredith Victory nearly capsized. We talk about the run with to Murmansk when a third of the ships are lost in that 19 ship convoy. The story about the phosphate catching fire And if I remember correctly, phosphate doesn't really do well with water, does it?
No, it catches on fire. Phosphorus catches on fire direct, without ignition, any source of ignition.
Yeah. And it could be just a really, really dangerous situation that is there. And in all these situations, it could have been the loss of the Mormac-Mar, the loss of the Meredith Victory, and then that would have been the loss of the 14,000 refugees and the loss to Korea today of the president of South Korea, because that all would never have happened in the process. One of the interesting things here locally, and the sun's acting goofy here.
Beaming down.
It's just, we've suddenly lost our. We're still here, though. We look at the cloud. One of the things that's interesting, the very first ship that Captain La Rue was on after the Pennsylvania Nautical School was the Francis E. Powell, which between like June and December of 1934 was basically sailing from the East Coast to Port Arthur. Though he did make a trip, I think, to Hawaii in that process too. But in 1942, 7 years after he left the vessel, the Powell actually was sunk by German U-boats after it left Port Arthur, after going to the Atlantic refinery here and sailed someplace else. So it's always very interesting how there were so many ways that this couldn't have happened. And we could even talk about leaving Hungnam, or trying to get to the dock in Hungnam, as Burley and Merle Smith were talking so well about on the Maritime TV about just getting in. And Merle brought up the point that the Navy destroyer came by and gave them a tremendously accurate map of the route into the harbor, a pencil drawn map of how to get to the dock and avoid the mines in the harbor. So the ship could have been lost going into Hungnam, ship could have been lost leaving Hungnam, and amazingly, none of those things happened along the way. One of the things that I don't have personally a lot of information about, though, is the time that Brother Marinus spent in the monastery. We know that he joined the monastery, and we know that he was a monk there for almost 40-something years, 46 years or so. And we know that he worked in the gift shop. But is there were you able to mine any additional information out of that?
Well, he had a number of other duties. The one that probably took the most of his time, and for which he was most famous, was his work in the gift shop. But he was the night porter for decades, meaning he was the fellow who answered the door if somebody came to the door after Compline, after evening prayers. He answered the door. He loved trimming the hedges, apparently, and he did that for years. Early on, he worked, when he was first there, probably even before he'd taken his vows, the abbot assigned him to work in the scullery, washing dishes, or he took care of chickens. Apparently the abbey at one time had chickens, and he took care of the chickens, but then apparently he had a hernia, and lifting the chicken feed was a problem for him. But he did as a good monk does. He did what the abbot assigned him to do. Interesting sidelight to the work in the gift shop is that he had in the gift shop a kind of a snack bar. He had coffee and I don't know what other beverages, and maybe soda pop or something, and little snacks that he would sell, because that section of the highway didn't have any restaurants, so people would stop in at the gift shop and he'd sell them something to eat. But he also apparently developed a regular following, people from the local area who would stop in and have a cup of coffee with him. And it was one of the facts that comes through as you research his life post Hungnam is his reluctance to talk about it. Early on, he was interviewed a couple of times. Of course, there were the various awards that were given to him and to the rest of the crew and to the ship. But after 1960, he doesn't talk about it in public. So the men and women who would stop in to see him and have a cup of coffee with him at the gift shop had no idea of his role at Hungnam until his obituaries appeared. He never talked about it. He would talk about the weather. He'd talk about politics. He'd talk about religion. He was very devoted to Our Lady of Fatima. He was very strongly anti-communist. But he never talked about Hungnam. So it's interesting. We talk about his humility. Without question, he was a very humble man.
Were you able to interview any of those folks who had visited him at the gift shop and just came by for coffee or talked with them?
No, I don't know any of their names. And as you know, with the turnover it's not clear that any of the monks even knew their names besides Marinus. It was just beyond my capability to do an on-site. I went to the Abbey. I spent an afternoon there, very kindly with Father Samuel Kim while they were doing their Christmas tree sale, the busiest time of the year. But I didn't interview anybody from the neighborhood, and that's over 20 years ago. In fact, it's more than that because he left the gift shop in the 90s.
Yep.
He died in 2001. He left the gift shop in the 90s, so it would have been almost 30 years ago for those folks.
Phil, in the course of your research on Brother Marinus, what is one of the things that most stood out to you, or maybe even most surprised you about him, or a favorite story that you got out of it?
Interesting question. Well, the first part of that question is easy. He is a man who knew his duty and did his duty to the best of his ability. And that quality I've always found to be very attractive, because all of us, well, some of us don't know what we should do. Some of us know what we should do and we don't do it. And some of us, all of us are at these three different levels at different times in our lives, or different times even during the day. So sometimes we know what we need to do and we actually do it. And when you look at La Rue's life and his life as Brother Marinus, he knew what his duty was and he always performed to the best of his ability. He didn't make excuses. He didn't complain. He put his head down and he did it. And I think that's part of why, part of what's so attractive about him is that he was a very extraordinary, ordinary man. Because we know from that generation other men and women who had that same sense of duty. I could think of my father-in-law, now deceased, who enlisted in the Navy when he was 16 or 17, lied about his age, was underweight and underage, but still managed to get in, and then fought all the way across the Pacific on an aircraft carrier. The sense of duty is and the ability, the willingness, the almost the joy of performing that duty is just tremendous. Now, I've talked myself out of the second half of your question. What was the second half? What was surprising?
Yeah, well, what was the most surprising thing you found out about him, or a favorite story that you learned about him?
Favorite story. Well, here's a little vignette. At the end of the 40s, he was in command of a victory ship, the Whittier Victory, in mid 1945, right as the war ended, and he stayed in command of that ship for a number of years, and then he basically sailed it into the reserve fleet in Olympia, Washington. Well, I guess there was no command available for him after that, so he then served on a passenger ship called the Uruguay, which was on a route from the Atlantic coast, typically New York, down to the Caribbean and Brazil, Argentina, etc. And when I looked at the official logs. These are the Coast Guard logs, which don't have a lot of information about what the ship did, but have the disciplinary information and the so-called slop accounts. You know, kind of the money that the crew spend on the ship. The only money I could find that he'd spent on the ship was for Spanish lessons. This is I think 1948 or 49. So he took almost every Spanish lesson that was offered. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now I have no idea if he ever learned to speak Spanish, but he was apparently interested enough that he actually took I forget 44 Spanish lessons, something like that. So I was kind of amused by that.
Well, it also shows a person who spent his relaxation time in good ways. You know,
Mhm.
one of the things that we're working to do in our research is to, you know, be able to show to the powers that be what was his what kind of a man this was, and showing that he's using his recreation time on board in these positive ways and ways that are developing himself is very helpful.
And I want to say right now that we have about 4 other people on this call with us, and that if you go up into the chat section, if you look at the top bar, you'll see this like little cartoon balloon. If you click that and open it up, it's very possible for you to send a message. So if you've got, we're going to go probably for about another 15 minutes, but if you've got some additional questions that you want to ask Phil, just pop that up there, and he can both see it, and we can ask him the question also. Phil, one of the things that really struck me about Captain La Rue was the fact that, one, he was a merchant marine captain. He came up through the hawsepipe, started as a quartermaster, finished as a shipmaster, but then he went into the monastery and he became a brother and never went on to priesthood. Was there any ever consideration of him going on to orders?
I have no idea. I don't know. I haven't seen any record of that. Maybe he figured that he was too young or too old to go back to school. I don't know. Or maybe it was just that what he was really looking for was a different type of service. You know, more always the ora, but also labora. He was happy to perform. But I didn't see anything that perhaps there would be something in the archives of the Abbey, which I didn't see, but I don't know.
Did he become a monk almost immediately after leaving the sea, or what was the time frame there?
Well, you remember what happened is he was in command of the I think it was the Mormac Moon in Japan, and he became ill with a kidney infection, and he spent several weeks in the hospital. And when he came back to the States, he requested a leave of absence because he wanted to try, he wanted to see what the life of a monk would be. And so he went to St. Paul's, and within a few weeks or a month, he decided that this was the life for him. So he actually wrote his resignation letter to McCormick Lines, thanking them for employing him for 20 years, but saying this was his new vocation. And so I don't know the dates in front of me, but he would have professed his simple vows maybe a year later, and then his solemn vows were in 59 or 60.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that'd be about right.
It's a couple-year process of discernment and you know, this clearly the judgment of the abbot that he's, you know, ready to live as a monk, and I think like any man or women in a religious community, they make a decision about whether they want him to live with them. So all that process goes on, but it didn't happen instantly. But instantly he decided he wanted to be a monk.
Since he didn't have a family, he didn't have a wife, didn't exactly have an anchor anywhere to go to. So when he signed off the ship, where did he go? What did he do?
He went back to the house on Diston Street in Philadelphia, which was his official address for for decades. And I believe his sister might have been living there at that time. Again, I'd have to go back and look. But that house is I guess, still in the family. Apparently the reason that he chose St. Paul's Abbey was it was the closest to Philadelphia, closest Benedictine Abbey to Philadelphia.
Now, does he have much family living now? Were you able to speak to any of his family?
I was not able to reach anyone, and I understand that that's a common problem. The generations, no, he was the youngest of his family. So his siblings all died. His parents died in the 40s while he was at sea during the war. His siblings died a few decades later, but his nieces and nephews, I apparently have not had enough of an interest in this story to reciprocate contact with with those who tried to reach out to them. I know that Bob Lunny had spoken with, I think it was his niece, who's now passed away. She was the most helpful, and unfortunately, by the time I was able to get to her, she was already on the other side. So, the next generation has apparently no interest in the story. Now, maybe they will as the cause proceeds. We can hope, but I'm not aware, Father. You can correct me, that they've been very helpful with the Historical Commission.
I don't have any access or contact with them. One of the thoughts that has been floating around in my mind is, did Brother Marinus ever get his medals, his World War II medals, his Korean medals that would have come if you petitioned the Maritime Administration? And if he didn't do it, a family member could do it. But I'm not getting any impression that anybody was really paying attention to that. And as you're saying, just try to connect. That we don't have anybody in our group, in the guild, that is blood relative connected to him, that
Right.
is associating to move this thing forward. But maybe, as this thing moves forward and becomes more known, and with your book, it's going to be really, really helpful to that. So let me ask.
It would be a conversation to have more offline, but I believe that there's a great nephew who I think he lives in the house still. So, and I anecdotally, somebody, maybe it was Bob Lunny, said that he has the story was that he had La Rue's medals, etc. But I have no idea.
I think Lenny told me that also. Vaguely you say that now. So before we wrap it up, tell me, how do I get your book?
Well, the physical book will be available from Amazon within a couple of days. So I apologize, it's not ready today, but it is literally at the printer. They're preparing the proofs so I can review them and hope that I've gotten all the typos out, and then it'll show up on Amazon, I would expect, by Christmas Day. It'll be available in the soft cover and hardback. Kindle version is available now, and I will have a small inventory at the headquarters of Catalina Press. You're looking at it. So I can provide copies as well, but in the near term, it'll be Amazon.
Yeah. So describe what's in the book from the beginning to the end.
So the book is divided into 3 parts, kind of like Gaul. The first part is entitled Mariner, and that goes from Philadelphia. So the chapters are Philadelphia, which covers his early life and then his service before the war. The next chapter is called War, which talks about the kind of U.S. preparation. Well, the world's tripping into the Second World War, notably with Germany and Britain, and then U.S. preparations, the Neutrality Acts, etc., and the impact that had on the merchant marine. Because as the Neutrality Act got modified by the end of the 30s, there was a lot more commerce in 1940 and early 41. There was a lot of commerce going to Britain and and France until France fell in U.S. bottoms. So then we get to Murmansk, and we cover the story of that QP13, PQ13, QP11. The next chapter is entitled Around the World, which tells the story of the Mars trip around the world, including to the Persian Gulf. The next chapter is entitled Liberty, when La Rue has his first duty on a Liberty ship, and in fact gets his first command. Then the final chapter of that section is called Victory, when La Rue gets his command of a Victory ship, and that takes us all the way to the beginning of the Korean War. So part 2 is entitled Rescue at Hungnam. That begins with a chapter called War Again, which talks about the Korean War and the origins and U.S. preparations for involvement. The next chapter is entitled Incheon and talks about the Meredith Victory's reactivation and the journey to Yokohama and then Incheon. The next chapter is Chosun, which motivates the Hungnam evacuation by talking about the battle at the Chosun Reservoir. And then the next chapter after that is kind of the hinge of the whole book, which is the chapter on Hungnam, which tells the story of the preparation for the evacuation, the realization that there was a big refugee problem, and then the actual evacuation, and notably the Meredith Victory's involvement in it. The final chapter of that section is entitled Legend, and what Legend does is it talks about the early accolades for the Captain La Rue and the Meredith Victory and her crew. And it's easy to forget now, but the story of the Chosun Reservoir and the Hungnam evacuation were front page news in late 1950. The idea that the Marines and the 7th Infantry would be trapped and then escape with all their equipment, at least in the case of the Marines, was huge news. And of course, the General MacArthur and his staff, as well as the military and politicos in Washington, were very anxious to tell this story, like this kind of snatching, not quite victory, but life from the jaws of defeat. So that closes that part. And then part 3 is entitled Monk. And that begins with a chapter called A Life on Land, which talks about La Rue's last command and then his transition to the monastery, his move into that vocation. The chapter after that is entitled Gallant Ship. And Gallant Ship talks about the additional recognition that took place in the middle to late 50s into 1960, most famously with the awarding of Meritorious Service Medal to Captain La Rue, Brother Marinus, and the awarding to the ship of the Gallant Ship plaque. And then the final chapter is entitled The Cause. And that takes us through La Rue's final decades into where we are today.
Well, that sounds really great. And what's really interesting is as we're wrapping up this recording in this video conference, basically 70 years ago today, because of the international dateline, Robert Lunny would be pretty much doing preparations to sail. Merlin Burley would be off watch, but probably they'd be doing overtime on deck trying to process all the folks coming in. And they're about ready to put down the hatches and pull up the gangway and start heading out to sea. So it's really
they started loading it at was it 9:30 Hungnam time on the 22nd, and they finished loading at about 11 o'clock on the 23rd.
Well, they're already out at sea now. With the international dateline with us, they're already now out at sea, starting the 350-mile run down to Busan.
So one of the mysteries that anybody who reads the book will see this, there are a lot of pictures kicking around of the refugees on board the ship, and no one is sure who took the pictures, because as we heard the other day, I know that Burley he told me that he'd taken pictures, There is a picture, a famous picture of Captain La Rue with a camera, and Merle also said he took pictures, but no one knows who took which picture, so they all deserve credit.
Yeah, they all take the credit for each other's pictures. You know, going through those two conversations with them, you would know that they none of them gives the other one any quarters during the process. Well, Phil, you know, I could continue this conversation for a lot longer, and maybe we'll reprise this thing in the near future. But it's really great. I can't tell you on behalf of one of the primary people pushing this cause how important the work that you did in. And please do not throw your 6,000 pages of stuff away, or whatever that amount that you got, because I know in the mission of the cause, they may need to get copies of some of this stuff. Yeah, even some of the letters that you come across, or some of the articles that you come across, they're going to need to get some kind of copies of that type of stuff. So you may be their best favorite friend after January 1st. Okay? So I want to thank you. I want to thank those who joined us for our meeting here. We've recorded it. We will post it up. We'll send it through the Guild as well as through Apostleship of the CUSA's newsletter. So thank you, Phil. Have a blessed and holy Christmas. And again, I can't thank you enough for the yeoman work you did in putting this together, which will be just so incredibly beneficial for the cause.
And it's really great that you were able to complete it in a time frame where Robert Lenny and Merle and Burley and these other guys, where they can enjoy this too. They've done so much to promote Captain La Rue and the Meredith Victory and to keep the story alive. And so you really are giving honor to them. And I just thank you for getting it out while they're still here to appreciate it.
It has been a delight and an honor to get to know those men, and it has been a privilege to be able to tell this story. It really has.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for being with us, and hopefully we'll do this sometime in the future again. God bless.
Amen.